Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the University of Calgary's webinar series. I'm Naveen Peters. I'm the Vice President of Advancement at the University of Calgary, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all of our new viewers, thank you so much for joining us. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused huge amounts of stress for families, and going back to school is only adding to the stress and confusion. So today we'll hear from two of our experts, Tanya Mudry and Jez Stone, about supporting your family during the coronavirus pandemic, especially as school starts up again. It's hard to believe that we're already at the end of August, but we find ourselves now relaunching our schooling and getting our kids and ourselves and our families ready to take on the new academic year. So our guests today will be talking about stressors on families during events like COVID-19 and what we can learn from literature on previous disasters and challenges. They'll give us tips for supporting your family under stress, fostering healthy relationships, and heading back to school. Our speakers will start off with a presentation and then answer questions from the audience. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as possible. This webinar will be available on demand, and we will email you a link once it is online. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Tanya Mudry is a registered psychologist and assistant professor of counseling psychology in the University of Calgary's Workland School of Education. She supervises and trains counseling psychology students. She practices at the Calgary Family Therapy Center, and she has a small private practice. She has specialized in clinical training in child and adolescent mental health and family therapy. Her research and writing have focused on family therapy, excessive behaviors, addiction, and relational recovery of critical care survivors and their families. Jez Stone is a registered provisional psychologist and PhD candidate in counseling psychology in the Workland School of Education, with specialized training in family therapy and group facilitation. Outside of her counseling practice, Jez is involved in research supporting the relational recovery of critical care survivors and their families. Her master's research focused on mothers' experiences of communicating to their children about the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, which informed her current dissertation research on familial experiences of COVID-19. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. We are so excited to be here today. So here's an overview about what we're going to chat about today. We're going to share some experiences that we've learned from the community. We're going to discuss what normal is, if there even such as is a normal response to something like COVID-19. We'll talk about how to strengthen relationships within the family, and then offer some tips and tricks for preparing for school. Next slide. Okay. So when we reached out to the experts, that's our friends and our family and the various community members, to see what their experiences were, they gave us lots and lots of challenges and lots of ideas to help guide our conversation today. So parents described many challenges: balancing multiple roles, sometimes with little support, trying to do homeschooling and work from home, managing toddlers, managing newborns, managing older folks that are living in the home. They had a lot of mental health struggles. So they talked about grief, they talked about anxiety, depression, guilt around what they should be doing or could be doing. There were relationship challenges, reduced time with their family, increased conflict, lots of fighting, lack of quality of time, even when they're spending tons of time together, limited options for childcare and supportive resources. Some parents talked about having to keep their kids in childcare when they would prefer not to. Some parents talked about having no childcare, and that was a struggle. They were running out of parenting ideas for entertainment. Some folks had special needs, kids with special needs. Negotiating screen time was challenging. There were social challenges. So sometimes friends and family had different ideas about COVID-19 and safety policies. Some felt disconnected from loved ones and a lack of support. One person said, we're living in a do-it-yourself culture of parenting rather than asking for help. And then finally, access to resources and sharing computers and Wi-Fi and all of the things in the family. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so especially, I mean, thinking about all these challenges, a lot of the families that I work with, I heard so many challenges related to screen time. And when we think about worries, we also asked our experts, family, friends, people like this, what are you worried about? And so they mentioned a lot of things, including things like quality of education. So things like, will my kids get the same quality of education, and what will that look like? Or relation to class sizes, how big are these class sizes going to be? Also information about social distancing, wearing a mask, what that's going to look like in a school setting. Kids with special needs also brought up a lot of worries for parents. So how are my kids their needs going to be met? And then of course there's this piece about bullying and being accepted by your peers. So is my child going to be bullied for making these safe choices, or what's that going to look like? How are they going to respond? Of course, there's safety worries as well. So will they get sick? Will my family members get sick? I have vulnerable people in my family. So what if they get sick? When we think of younger kids especially, play is such an important part of learning. And so there were worries around, if you take away that engagement of play, what's my child going to be doing all day? How will schools ensure that they can still have safe play without taking it away completely? Of course, there were challenges and worries about potential school closures. We don't know what's going to happen. And then obviously our graduates this upcoming year, whether that is kindergarten, grade 6, middle school, or even our high school, grade 12s, will they be able to walk the stage?
Undoubtedly, COVID has created significant struggles for families, which is compounded if there's any sort of pre-existing struggles in the family, or mental health struggles with kiddos or parents, if there's relational difficulties or finance struggles. And yet there's this expectation that we should continue to go about our daily lives as we normally would, or that we should just somehow adjust to this new normal. And this got us thinking, and Jez and I were chatting about, like, what exactly is normal? What's an appropriate response? What is a normal response? And we decided that normal is just a setting on a washing machine. There's no such thing as normal. Normal looks different for everyone. So we've decided to challenge this idea of normal and choose words maybe like maybe, possible, perhaps, which feels a little bit less imposing. So we do know from the research that there are many possible outcomes for adults and young adults struggling with natural disasters such as pandemics, and some of this comes from Jez's research. So adults and young adults, excuse me, might have insomnia, or they might be oversleeping, they might be hypervigilant or cautious, anxiety, increased emotions, they might be more angry or more irritable, lots of fear, worry, sadness, grief, which can trickle down into our thoughts and our behaviors. So we may have difficulty making decisions, we may be more distracted, we may get angry towards other people, we may be questioning our beliefs. And then in response, when we have sort of a feeling of lack of control, we tend to create control in our lives, which might be like routines or schedules or preparing, and sometimes over preparing or overbuying, which we saw with the sort of toilet paper and Lysol crisis that happened earlier this year.
Yeah, and for younger people, stress just looks a little bit different. And so it may be harder for parents to pick up on. You might notice things like hyperactivity or maybe some silliness. You can see some emotional outbursts or those lovely tantrums that we love so much. You might see some oppositionality or defiance towards what you're trying to help when you're trying to help your kids. You can also see maybe some clinginess or that really attached relationship to a parent. Or you can see the opposite, pulling away, withdrawing from engaging in the family, things like this. And then when we think of other things like sleeping, eating, those might look different. We might experience some physical complaints in our kiddos. So things like headaches, stomach aches. And then of course, when we think of school, it's harder to pay attention, harder to focus. And so there might be some academic difficulties or some school related problems as well. And the tricky thing is with kids is that they have so much more less control or agency in their lives. And especially this is heightened in stressful situations. They're also at a huge disadvantage because the rational and logical part of their brains are still developing, that part that's right behind your eyes right here. And so whereas parents have these big, beautiful, developed brains, and you've had years of practicing and dealing with the hard stuff, kids really do rely on adults to show them how to respond in specific situations and provide that control and agency that they just don't have yet. But oftentimes, if we're stressed, we can unintentionally model our stress to our kids in ways that we actually prefer not to. So we want to make sure that we're cautious about that.
Next slide.
Next slide. And so again, what we know from the research is that any disaster event will disrupt the family in some way. But the good news is that for majority of the families, these experiences of disruption, they don't actually cause lasting harm like we worry it will. And so like Tanya and I were talking about, there will be things like anxiety, stress, uncertainty is most definitely going to be heightened. And some people may experience other things like sadness, depression, grief. These are all appropriate responses to a pandemic. Believe it or not, we do actually recover.
And kids are super resilient and they're adaptive and their little brains are figuring it all out, just like you and I are, except they might need a little extra help to figure it out.
Yeah, and so just because you're seeing different behavior from your kids doesn't necessarily mean that this will stick in the long term. So just take a deep breath in those really hard moments and remind yourself that it's okay not to be okay. Whether that means feeling guilty about not having enough time to give to your kids or your family, or maybe you're feeling fed up and not wanting a vacation from your family. Maybe you're feeling worried about the health of your loved ones or yourself. You might even feel out of control or just tired of not knowing. You could even be exhausted after your 5th or 6th or maybe your 10th Zoom meeting of the day. And you might also experience some judgment towards you or your family from others. But you might also be energized. You get to stay home and not deal with commuting. These are all okay, regardless of what your experience is. It's expected. And so kids are also going to have these kinds of feelings, and it might be helpful to have some chats about what actually makes sense to them. This might look like things like, it is strange to not be able to hug your friends, or not being able to share your snacks at school, or having to wash your hands 1,000,000 times a day. That sucks. Or following the arrows in your favorite toy store when all you want to do is run around and grab all the things that you like. We also have to wear these hot and uncomfortable, itchy masks, which is not fun at all. So rather than following that up with but we really have to do this, just take a moment and sit in the dark with them and just hear them out. We want to make sure that we're waiting before we try to fix or problem solve. Things are changing so quickly, and having these conversations with your family members are really important pieces to writing your COVID story. But like everything, there is a balance, and we want to make sure that we don't overtalk the situation. So bringing these conversations up every now and then when you notice things like frustration or fatigue, but just make sure to give some time for sitting in that dark, sitting with those hard feelings, and wait with them when they're not okay before you move into problem solving mode. It can be hard because it's so uncomfortable to see our little ones be in pain, but actually with sitting in the dark and validating those emotions, it can do so much more than trying to fix and solve the problem. So it might be helpful to keep in mind that your kids will fare better when these conversations happen, when everybody is calm, not just them, but you as well. So don't try to talk through the hard stuff when there are things like tears or furrowed brows or slamming doors or screaming and yelling. We just want to make sure that you calm down, sit in the dark, come back to those teachable moments when everybody is calm. Next slide.
All right, family therapy time.
Yeah. So this is Tanya and what Tanya and I do best. We do know that social connection is a huge part of promoting resiliency and bouncing back from stress, especially when there is stress that's related to a natural disaster like a pandemic. And so even though it can be really hard to enjoy those moments, we want to make sure that we're turning towards our relationships in order to boost our family and keep everybody happy. So Tanya, you and I are both family therapists, and in family therapy, we're trained to look for those relationship patterns that keep families either fighting or stuck in the stress. And at the same time, we're also looking for helpful patterns that actually invite families out of that fighting and that stress and moving towards more healthier ways of being together. So we thought that today we could share a few of those healthy patterns with you and try and invite you to practice some of these with your family. So one common pattern that we see often in families is criticizing a family member, which invites that other family member to then defend themselves. So for example, if I were to say to Tanya, "Ugh, your room is a disaster. You're always on the phone or you're gaming and you never want to do anything with the family. What's up?" She might say in return,
"It's my room. I cleaned it today anyway, and I never get to play video games. You never let me do what I want, and you're working all the time anyway. So I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this."
So you can see how Tanya's defensive response will probably invite a couple of things from me. I can either respond with defensiveness myself, maybe defending how I'm not working all the time, or I have to work to put a roof over our head. Or I might criticize her attitude and taking a certain tone with me. And so if we think of actually what these two pieces are, if we think about what a criticism actually is, it's our desire to invite a different behavior from that other person because our needs aren't being met. And if we think of what defensiveness is, it's usually our intention to protect our own integrity, our own good intentions. But the problem with this is that all the other person sees is their own pain or their hurt feelings. And so instead, it's much more helpful to outwardly notice the good intentions of the other person, which will most likely then invite the other person to want to contribute in a different way. So for instance, Tanya, I really wanted to let you know that I noticed that you put a lot of effort into your cleaning of your room today, and I just wanted to thank you. So even though her cleaning her room might not be up to my standards, that's okay because she put effort in. And this will likely invite Tanya to perhaps increase her efforts next time because her good intentions have been acknowledged. Now, the key to these patterns is that positive exchanges in a relationship actually will invite more positive exchanges. And in this example, particularly, I am expressing gratitude for the good things that I'm noticing, which helps Tanya feel proud. And when we feel proud, we want to do more. And so a tip in being successful in these new ways of engaging with our family members is trust. We want to trust that they actually do in fact have good intentions, even if we're questioning that. Next slide.
Okay, so the next common pattern that we see in families is controlling leading to rebelling. So this particularly under high stress is when one person gets nervous and they want to sort of control the situation. Happens with spouses, happens with parents trying to control teens or kiddos in stressful situations. So if I were concerned with Jez's sort of lack of motivation, her sort of lack of productivity, refusing to do schoolwork, I might create a detailed schedule for Jez to follow. And I might have lots of experience and practice organizing my life, so I know how to do it. And I might say, "Hey, Jez, I created this schedule for you." How do you think you would respond, Jez?
Oh, I would probably either refuse to do it or I would intentionally hit my snooze button like 16 times and just not get out of bed.
So she would probably rebel with my good intentions to control her day so that she could graduate from school. So instead, I could sit Jez down and say, "Hey, Jez, how are we going to get through this semester? I was thinking maybe we could figure something out. How much time do you think you need to do your math? You need to put piano in there. You need time for gaming and to talk on the phone with your friends or to Skype or whatever you like to do." So we might figure out that 4 hours of work and maybe 30 minutes of piano would be enough to get done sort of by 3 p.m. And then she would have time to game in the evening and earn that time. This not only gives her some control and agency in how she spends her time, she'll more likely take on more responsibility and see herself as being able to take responsibility for herself. In the case of COVID, though, we might have to reduce our expectations for our kiddos a little bit. It's not necessarily about how much we get done or if we get everything done. Some days it might be about getting anything done. And with, you know, it might be getting kids into bed in time. It might be teenagers jumping through the shower a couple of times a week. It might be, you know, getting the bare minimum done. It's important to celebrate sort of those small wins and surviving the day, not always focusing on perfection and getting things just right. Next slide. So another common pattern we see in families and in couples is pursuing leading to distancing. And so it's easy for us to get sort of hyper vigilant in our relationships. We might worry about our family members' well-being. Sometimes we pursue connection and pursue sort of information. And when we do that, the other person might become more distant.
It's kind of like repelling a magnet, right?
Yeah, and there's that saying, anything you chase will run away. So this happens in our relationships as well. So if I continually ask Jez, hey Jez, honey, how are you feeling? Can we talk? Can we sit down and talk? I'm worried about you. She might respond,
ugh, leave me alone. I didn't do anything. I just want to go to my room.
So she ends up shutting herself down, distancing herself even more. Instead, I could say something like, hey, I noticed you're quiet today. If you want to chat, I'll be in the kitchen. Then I just give her some space, which might invite her to seek some connection if and when she chooses. And it might not be about talking about why she's quiet. It might just be telling a story about one of her friends, or gossiping about what's going on at school, or having a little dance party, or getting some ice cream together. Sometimes connection is more important to focus on the light stuff and the happy stuff rather than the serious stuff. However, sometimes we do need to talk to our kiddos about the hard stuff, and oftentimes parents will say they have trouble talking to kiddos about feelings and emotions and all of that. So what we like to do is sort of narrate our experience outwardly, and it's literally acting like a narrator. So I might say, oh, I'm feeling really tired today, and I'm so annoyed with these Zoom meetings and I can't focus. I think I'm going to take a 15-minute break and get some apple and some peanut butter and return back and see if that feels better. Or if I'm frustrated with some kids in my life, I might say, oh, my heart's beating really fast and I can feel my cheeks getting warm. I think I need to take a little time out, have a little break, and then I'll come back and help you with your puzzle. What this does is sort of normalize the experience of emotions and models sort of some self-reflection, emotional regulation, and some healthy problem solving. Next slide.
So Tanya and I sat down to switch topics onto preparing for school. We sat down and we really wanted to consider what would be the most helpful in returning to school. So first and foremost, modeling expected behaviors for our kids is huge. We want to model what it means to wear a mask and socially distance in lineups, for example, at the store, in public. You can even model how to play while social distancing, or find creative ways on how to judge what's appropriate for distance. So putting a hockey stick in between you, or then putting 4 hockey sticks, and just noticing, how does it feel to be this far away? What about this far? You can also come up with some silly ways to greet somebody rather than giving them a hug. You can do things like, Tanya and I like to get our families to give them a big bear hug themselves and just give a good squeeze. Not only does this give you some physical touch, but it makes sure that you're communicating that care. I mean, you could do also the elbow bumps or the toe taps or the air high fives, whatever works for you and for your family. We also want to you can also make a game of, following the arrows down the aisles of the grocery store. Things like, one side is lava and we're balancing on a bridge. How well can you balance on that bridge? And, oh, don't fall in the lava. Something silly like that, but getting your kids on board to actually follow those arrows. You can also help your kids get used to wearing a mask for extended periods of time by pairing it with funner activities that they're already doing at home. Screen time is a perfect example. So if they don't want to wear a mask while they're doing screen time, then setting those clear expectations outwardly, letting them know what you expect, and then following through on them. So no mask, no screen. You can also give your kids a sense of control and having them pick out their favorite cloth patterns. If they like a certain mask in particular, order multiples of those so you can wash them and not have them wear those dirty masks when they actually need to be washed. You can avoid those power struggles. If you have any disposable masks, you can have a fun evening of decorating them using things like non-toxic markers, some stickers, some glue, some glitter, whatever your kids are into. Something that also might be interesting to try is to replace the name mask with a fun narrative. So a superhero shield or a princess veil or whatever your kids are into, try and create something that you can call it different than a mask. Often when we think of language, a huge percentage of our language is nonverbal communication. And there's something like 55% of that comes just from our faces. And when you cut off half of our face, our mouths in particular, which is the point of the face that children look to understand social norms, then they're really cutting off a big part of that social learning, that emotional learning. And so you can play a facial expressions game while wearing a mask. You can do things like guessing each other's facial expressions or guessing each other's emotions. You can also try to match each other's emotions and then take the mask off and see who did it better. We want to also invite as much positive praise as possible when wearing the mask. So even if it's for a second at the beginning, noticing and letting your child know that you've noticed that they're wearing a mask. You can even start a token economy if you'd like, which all that is an exchange for a reward for a desired behavior that you want. So when they wear a mask, they earn a token, and when they reach so many tokens, they can work their way up to a larger reward, like picking the movie for movie night or something. You can also invite the whole household if you want. So putting masks on your children's favorite toys or stuffed animals, whatever works. And last, your family might come up against others who are doing things a little bit differently than you are. That's pretty expected right now. So talk to your kids about why your family is choosing to follow certain safety practices, and this will help them get them on board. You can also let them know that there might be some people that have different opinions about safety, and that's okay, but this is the way that we're doing this. Not only does this help get them on board, but it helps them give an argument to stand up to others and advocate for their safety choices at school. So it's more than just not being allowed to hug because I don't know why. It's more about, it's because I don't want to get my family sick, or I don't want to get you sick. Or maybe it's just, I want to do my part so I can play soccer again next year. Another thing that you can try is role playing with your child to have these kinds of conversations with others, especially if they're a little bit worried about what that might look like. So asking them, so if somebody calls you stupid for wearing a mask, what are you going to say? What are you going to do? If they don't know, then let's brainstorm together, and then let's practice. Let's take on a different role. Have them trying on those different roles, and actually practicing will help them be more successful when that time comes, if that time comes. You also want to make a plan for your child to seek support from an adult when or if they are struggling with peers. We like to use the rule of 3. And so if a child is experiencing something like bullying, then telling 3 adults rather than 1 will increase their chances that at least one of those adults will care enough to do something about it. It also is helpful to speak from a we perspective or an us perspective when we're making safety requests of others. So things like, hey, Tanya, can we please have a little more space between us? This is different than, Tanya, I need you to step back, please. Because it assumes that we are having a shared responsibility for safety. And above all, we want to advocate for our children, of course. So if they do require any specialized support, have those conversations with the people in your world and who can help you make those changes and meet their needs. Teachers, school staff, maybe it's coaches or whoever is in your world that can support your family. Just remember though that teachers and school staff, they also have their own families. They also might have their own worries or hesitations for coming back. And so really working together as a team is really important. If your children's needs are better met at home and this is possible for your family, then perhaps homeschooling might actually be a better consideration if it's possible. And of course, last but not least, we want to make sure that there's a plan for any unexpected events to help you gain some of that control, just in case someone gets sick or things close again or changes happen at school. Try to think of some different options for different scenarios. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, every family will be different. The way that you adapt to these changes, those strategies that you take on are going to take on different forms than other families. And some of these may work for you, but not work for others. And so, Tanya, do you want to talk about school, and then I can?
Yeah, so in terms of school, we were thinking about recruiting sort of other people in your community, recruiting high school students or university students to act as tutors or to help deliver curriculum, that sort of thing. Oftentimes our kids will listen to other adults and other young adults better than they listen to us. We can be creative at school. So school at home doesn't need to necessarily be homeschooling. So can we count birds? Can we look for bugs? Can we go for walks? Can we help fix the cupboards and do some building related activities, science experiments, cooking? The other piece that we kind of mentioned already is getting work done doesn't necessarily mean traditionally. So as long as the work gets done, if it's all day Thursday instead of a little bit every day and that works for your family, go for it. In terms of community, consider recruiting a pod family, which is sort of like a fancy word for social bubble. Jez and I are both sort of relationally oriented therapists, and we're really, really into social support. So invite people in your community to help you out, your neighbors, close relatives, friends nearby. How can you support each other? What happens if somebody gets sick? What happens if somebody needs to pick somebody up? Those types of things.
Yeah, and remember too, to have compassion and respect for those who hold different perspectives than your own. A good example of this is, okay, if I were to bring up this coffee mug, okay, and I were to ask you, what do you see? Describe the coffee mug that you see. You might say, okay, it's an aqua color. There's some speckles. If you can see that, you can see that there's a black rim around the top. There's a thin handle. It's quite a small coffee cup. It fits within my hands. But if you were to ask myself what I see, you can tell that it's somewhat different. So we're looking at the same thing, but my perspective has a logo. I have something that is different than your perspective. And so even though we're both describing the exact same item or the same situation, we might be seeing something different, but equally as valid. And so we want to have those kind of examples in mind when we disagree with other people's perspectives. And when it comes to family, we want to make sure that we pay attention to what your kids or even other family members are showing you. So kind of like you're taking a pulse of your family, if you will. This might look like noticing your child being a little extra needy after dinner time. And with everything on your plate, this might be the very last thing that you want to deal with after dinner, especially after you've been juggling work and maybe homeschool. But as we spoke about, those small moments of connection can actually go a really long way towards promoting that resiliency. So things like a quick story or a little hug or maybe a dance party to your child's favorite song. Kids really, I hear so many times from parents that kids just want them to watch them play video games or watch a YouTuber that they love play video games. And so spend 10 minutes of watching that with them. Even though it might be a little painful for yourself, this means a lot to them because you're showing interest in what they like to do. You can also just, listen for when they want to vent, or it might actually just be sitting in the same space, not looking at each other, not making eye contact, and maybe you're sharing some ice cream. What we don't want to do though is create this mountain out of a molehill, if you will. So we want to encourage you to be cautious in how much attention you're giving to watching for problems in your family. If we watch for problems, sometimes we can make problems when all we really need is some damn ice cream, right? So take those moments.
Next slide.
Slide.
So before we end, we wanted to sort of leave you with an invitation to think about what's going well. What are you grateful for in the last 5 months? Sometimes this is easier to think about with other people. So I'm grateful for my son for helping out his little sister. I'm really happy my spouse took care of dinner while I had this meeting. I'm grateful for my friend who brought me groceries. And while these are important, it's also important to think about what you're grateful for yourself, what you're proud of. So, you know, I took time to myself. I had a bath. I read my book. I drank some water. The kids were fed. So in the last 5 months, what are you grateful for? What are you already doing well? And this exercise can be helpful to do with your kiddos as well, sort of at bedtime, asking them what 3 things they're grateful for. And it can be super easy: chocolate chip cookies, petting the dog, tickling the cat, you know, watching their YouTube or play video games. It can really go a long way. Before we sort of open up to questions, we have been given permission to share a giant resource list that Jez had created on behalf of CanLearn. So we'll make that available to everyone. And there's also tons of resources on the university website and on the Integrated Services and Education website as well.
Great. So I want to thank you both for sharing your insight, research, perspective, and advice during what is a very challenging time. I think there was a lot of tidbits of information for parents, not only as they help their kids adjust to a new schooling environment, whether that is at home or online or in the classroom, but also how we continue to navigate our emotions and the anxiety or stress that is all around that. I want to so feel free, everybody who's watching and listening, to pose your questions via the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen. But I want to kick it off and ask a little bit about resiliency in children, because there is this tendency to come in and, as you mentioned throughout your presentation, solve the problem for them on their behalf. I'm wondering if you can expand upon that concepts of resiliency in this environment of COVID-19, or, you know, the economic uncertainty around us, the political uncertainty around us at a global level. You know, there's a lot of factors that are at play here. So how do you cultivate that proactively within your children and resist that urge to kind of step in and solve it immediately on their behalf?
Jez, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Sure. I think if we come back to that idea of trusting the integrity and the skills that our children have, and then that last slide that Tanya talked about. So what are your children already good at? Even if it is, you know, putting their toys away with direction, that's still a strength that we can remind ourselves of and capitalize on when things aren't going so well. And so we have to keep in mind too that our children are practicing. They're practicing these skills that they don't yet have. So if we think of like a tool kit, right? Parents have a full toolkit. Maybe there's a few things missing that they're working on to get, but kids have much less tools than parents do. So if a child in their toolkit, they have, you know, a spoon and maybe a paintbrush, and you give them an IKEA box for a bookshelf, they're going to have a hard time building that bookshelf. They might be able to do it with a lot of effort with that spoon, but they're going to have a harder time than you would if you have a hammer and maybe a screwdriver, right? So we want to make sure that we always are reminding ourselves that our kids are practicing. And as they're practicing, they are continuing to push through. They do come up with challenges developmentally every day, and they use those for progressing and developing. So we want to remind ourselves that resiliency does happen with the right ingredients.
And the other piece is that resiliency happens when we face challenges. So it's good. It's actually good for kids to experience harder things and to work through them and develop the skills that they need. The other piece is inviting them into some of the problem solving. Kids have really good ideas. They might not be the same ideas as you, but asking them, you know, speaking to them, being honest with them, but using age-appropriate language to come up with some good ideas. So saying like, we can't really go to the movies right now, or we can't go out for dinner as much. Do you have any good ideas about having family outings? So they might say, oh, well, let's have a picnic in the floor and watch a rerun of their favorite movie that they like to watch, rather than doing sort of an expensive outing when money's tight. So it's about inviting kids into problem solving in ways that are appropriate for their age and for their level of development.
And if we think too, I'm just going to add to that. Sorry, Naveen. If we think too that we come back to that connection piece, those those moments of sharing an experience, sharing a memory, those are what they're going to remember in the long run, rather than the struggles or the challenge. That we remember those good memories much more often than we remember the harder times, especially at younger ages.
Thank you both so much. And we're getting some great questions coming in. I want to start with one of the ones we have up to the top here, in terms of dealing with these what if anxieties, particularly with teens. And given that there is so much uncertainty out there, how do you handle that uncertainty as it relates to anxiety and the questions about the future?
Yeah, good question.
I think the first and most basic piece is sitting with them in that uncertainty and that anxiety. Yeah, what if? Like, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what school's going to look like. We don't know what next year will be. And sitting sort of in that discomfort and their pain with them is sort of the primary thing. And that's part of that connection, is acknowledging the young person's struggle and the fact that you're feeling the same thing. I don't know. I don't think anybody watching this will know what will be happening. So the number one is keeping that connection by relating to our young people, by talking to them, by sitting with them, and not trying to fix immediately or say, oh, it's fine, it's just high school, or oh, you're going to graduate, it's just fine. Don't dismiss, rather sit with them to sort of feel what they're feeling.
Yeah. You can also remind each other what you know, right? We know that today we're going to do a board game, do an hour of reading, and then we're looking forward to, tacos tonight. This is what we know. And right now we're just going to live in the day, and we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like, or we don't know what next week is going to look like with school starting. But what we know is that at the end of the day after school, you're going to come home and we're going to do something fun. So reminding them of what they actually know, what you know, and almost committing to some level of certainty, even if it's mealtime or a game or something that they can look forward to.
And making some plans can be helpful too, right? So having some scenarios in place could be helpful, especially for young people who like to have their lives sort of scheduled and planned out. It might be helpful to have some ideas of, if this happens, then we have this option and this option, without going too far down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's really helpful information and advice. So much of what you've talked about relates to that family structure, or the core of bringing it back to having those points of connection and those strong relationships. And I want to kind of get to a few of the questions here around what if there are differences of opinion when it comes to managing through COVID, or whether to send the kids back to school that exist within that family structure. How do you navigate through that?
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
I can start. So it can be helpful to talk about where you differ and really lay it out to see where do we differ and what do we agree on, whether differences of opinions are going to opening up your social bubble and expanding to invite more people, or whether you actually agree on going to school, or maybe you disagree on school. Finding out what exactly you disagree on and what you agree on, and then finding some compromise. So why is this important to you? Trying to see each other's perspectives and get almost as if you were taking on a scientific kind of approach to it, really understanding the why behind the other person's opinion and perspective can help you give some context to what it is that they disagree with.
I think exactly, Jess. I think that's great. And I think the piece about the common ground is really important. So both of us are worried about our kids, and this is why we're disagreeing. It's not because one of us has, ill will. We both really, really care. We both love our kids equally. And this is why we're disagreeing, and start with that common ground first, and then move towards problem solving.
I've heard from many parents, and as myself, someone that has 3 kids that are going back to school next week, many parents are concerned about the mental health, the longer term mental health implications, about, creating a very sanitized culture, this potential of like fear of the other, or wearing masks. What type of conversations ought parents, should we be having, both perhaps here or at school, about the longer term, perhaps mental impacts of COVID?
Yeah.
Jez, did you want to speak to that with your research?
Yeah, so as we mentioned in the webinar, it can be so easy to see distress in our family members and think that this distress is going to off-road them onto a different path towards something that might be more undesired or harmful in the future. But what actually happens is the majority of us, we do recover, we figure it out, we stabilize. Even if like we're taking normal off the table, we're stabilizing eventually. And what we're doing right now is we're working towards that. I don't know if Tanya, you have anything to add towards that?
Yeah, I think in general, people are pretty resilient. And when we create sort of a context to talk through and to problem solve and work together, we fare better. And from sort of previous research around natural disasters and things like that, when we take a family perspective or a multi or community perspective, outcomes are much, much better. So invite people in, don't struggle on your own. Don't try to have these conversations or expect people to kind of figure it out on their own. Get support, create groups. We're trying to create bubbles for people to share their experiences, because then you don't feel so alone. And when you don't feel so alone, you're much more likely to not suffer consequences from external factors. The other piece about that is if you're really seeing signs, seek help. There's therapists, there's counselors, there's family therapists, school counselors, all kinds of different support. So if you are feeling out of your depth and want a little booster or a little extra help, please go check those people out. Check us out. We've got lots of referrals and on the website as well in terms of who to seek help from.
And now, what should parents be doing to support the teachers as they welcome back their students?
I think having a clear line of communication is very important when it comes to having that sense of community like Tanya was talking about. So we're almost as if not only using teachers as a source of education, but we're inviting teachers to be a part of our community of support, and making sure that when we're making requests of teachers or when we're inquiring about our children's needs or how they're doing, also acknowledging that they themselves might be experiencing a different perspective or their own struggles. So having that clear line of communication, sometimes that might look like a journal back and forth from home to the teacher, or setting up, a monthly meeting, if that's possible and within their scope of work, then doing that, or having your kids relay messages on or notes or whatever that looks like, however you can maintain that clear line.
The other piece is kindness and respect and compassion. Teachers are human. They're not these robots just teaching our children. They are struggling and they have their own stuff. They might have illness in their family. So just really coming from this place of understanding and compassion and care and respect for them can go a long way. The kind words, the cookie or the coffee can really be helpful to show your appreciation.
There's a bit of a theme developing perhaps in some of our questions about parents' own mental health and wellness, and being able to be that rock or that anchor for your children and for your family. How do you navigate through that when there's a lot of stressors right now on parents themselves?
So for sure, parents, it's almost that oxygen mask analogy, right? And so if we think of the oxygen mask, we do need to take care of ourselves first before we're able to successfully care for other people. As maybe cheesy as that sounds, it's very true. So when we are able to make sure that if we can get enough sleep, or if we can, at least if we're not getting enough sleep, we're eating somewhat healthy, or we're getting outside and getting some fresh air, we're changing up our scenery as much as we can, even if that is within the home. You can even consider dedicating a specific area of your home for you time, for parent time only, right? So whether that is the walk-in closet of your bedroom, or maybe it is the kitchen, or maybe it is a bathroom, whatever that looks like, this is John's time, this is Jane's time, whatever, however you want to title that, and make sure that you bracket that time off, even if it is 15 minutes. I know a lot of the clients that I work with sometimes just go and sit in their car for some time. And that space is also really, really important when we're always together and there's almost this relational burnout that's happening. So getting that space, however you can, is very important. And then when you're taking that space, using it to its full potential, so you are refueling, rather than using distraction techniques like scrolling on Facebook. If that helps, fantastic. But you might also want to consider other things like taking a moment and just reflecting on how your day has been, all the things that you've been grateful for, things like that.
Sometimes parents need to put themselves first so that they can take care of their family. And it's also really good role modeling. So if you're showing your kids that, you know what, I need some time by myself, or I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to spend time with auntie, or whatever that might look like, you're also role modeling to your kids that you're taking care of yourself. The other piece is that if you need support, seek it. Find a counselor, find a therapist, speak to other people. I think one of the things that parents feel is that they're the only ones struggling, or they're the only ones that are having a hard time. And many, many people, arguably all of us, are having a hard time. And so reach out and talk to people. The experience of feeling like you're not alone can do wonders in terms of coping.
Yeah, that sentiment towards community support, and relying upon those that are within your network and within your bubble, our new verb, is really important during this time. There's a few other thematic questions here around the rebuilding of trust, or the tension that may exist when spouses are perhaps not on the same page when it comes to education or schooling, or even, whether you see grandma this week, or masking, so what advice do you have for parents who perhaps ought to reset their own relationship in order to manage through this pandemic?
Yeah, this is tricky, especially if there is conflict within the parental relationship or the co-parenting relationship, whatever that looks like. If there is a disagreement or conflict, reminding yourself that this is the other parent of your child, who plays also just as much of an important role as you do. And so by honoring and respecting just the role itself that other parent has, can really contribute to shifting your feelings of whatever that might look like. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but we want to make sure that we are honoring those who are involved in our children's lives, even if we don't agree with them. Sometimes it can be helpful to kind of take a trip back to memory lane as well, and thinking about, okay, we're not agreeing, and we haven't been agreeing over these last 6 months, and I'm super stressed. It's starting to question my relationship, perhaps. What do I remember that was good in our relationship? What do I respect, or why did we get together in the first place? Kind of thinking backwards and reminding yourself of those good things can help shift our mindset just a little bit to open our perspective for more agreement, if you will.
The other piece around that is assume good intentions. So even if you have a disagreement or you don't agree on things, going back to what good intentions does that person have for your kids, or for the family, or for the relationship. In terms of trust, usually if there's broken trust, we talk about demonstrating trustworthiness. So if there's something that you're needing to sort of amend, it's demonstrating that you're doing the work, which is a lot of work to do that. But the person that you're sort of trying to amend the relationship with is going to be a little bit attuned to that, or hypervigilant and watching for it. So sometimes it takes a little bit of work in terms of demonstrating that trustworthiness, demonstrating change, even if it feels a little bit over the top.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm cognizant of the time that we have today, and getting back to your last slide about gratitude and thinking of the things that we are grateful for today, I want to say thank you to you both and everybody who's watching and listening today, that I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you. Next time I yell at my daughter about cleaning her room, I will try to take a moment and say, I'm glad you tried. How can I help you put your clothes away properly, right? But as you mentioned, I think it is so important to pause and to take that moment to reflect upon everything that we do have to be grateful for, particularly as we continue to embark upon this journey together. So thank you both very much for sharing your insights and answering our questions. And everyone who signed up today and participated will receive an email with a link to the resources available should you require additional information and support. And before we go, I'd like to remind our campus community that our mental health supports are available online, particularly for our faculty and staff and students. And that is all for us today. And I hope you will join us for our next webinar about changing the narrative of exclusion, LGBTQ+ inclusion in faith and healthcare, which will be a very fascinating discussion on September 1st. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, you can find more webinars and podcasts and other content by visiting ucalgary.ca/community. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will see you soon.